Starting with their days wandering through Pond Creek, Earl and Carl were explorers. One day in early 1920, Earl found this isolated spot called Ponce Inlet, just south of Daytona, Florida. An old lighthouse marked the spot. The only problem was the mosquitoes. They resembled aircraft carriers. Many of the boat crews were afraid of being carried off. Nonetheless, this is where the illegal booze pipeline began. Here in this isolated location, liquor was offloaded into waiting cars, which headed across the back roads and blue highways to southern Illinois. It was during this time that the boys met Charlie Berger. Charlie was a Russian Jewish immigrant whose aim in life was to be rich and famous. One day he walked into the Shelton Saloon on his way to meet Art Newman at the Arlington. A connection was made. By late 1920, Charlie had moved to Harrisburg, bought a big lot to build a house on, and become a full-fledged customer. Charlie was an up-and-coming criminal with a hair trigger. He was not to be trifled with. Booze was being delivered and business was growing when events in Williamson County turned deadly. The Lester mine strike began in Herrin when John Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers Association, approved a strike in 1922 for higher wages. Scabs were brought in as replacements, and all hell broke loose when coal was shipped to Chicago in the dead of night, violating the truce. Buildings were destroyed, and 23 replacement workers were killed and mutilated on the march back to Herrin. Finally, order was restored. The slain workers were buried in Potter's Field. Such was life in bloody Williamson. Charlie got his foot in the door by supplying weapons to the Union. The Sheltons stayed clear. Charlie opened a roadhouse and brothel on Route 13 between Marion and Johnson City, which he called Halfway. With the Sheltons supplying him, his business grew. He shot 2 people dead at Halfway, but was ruled to have acted in self-defense. One of the dead was his good friend Cecil Knighton. The other was a career criminal named Whitey Doring. Charlie shot them both. The Sheltons opened their own establishment on Old Route 13, west of Marion, near Culp. It could be said later on that this was the pinnacle of the Shelton-Berger relationship. They were getting along fine in 1923 when along came S. Glenn Young, Caesar Cagle, and the KKK. Glenn contracted to head up the Law Enforcement League, which was allied with the Klan. They intended to crack down on bootleggers and enforce the 18th Amendment. Cagle was a Herrin constable who ran with Glenn. One night, they raided Earl Shelton's place and pistol-whipped him badly. "This isn't over," said Earl. He meant it. Not long after, Earl, Jack Skelcher, and Charlie Briggs were at the Rome Club on 14th Street with a few dozen knights of the Flaming Circle, anti-Klan folks, stirring up anti-Klan sentiment. They started walking toward Smith's Garage, a one-story brick building that faced Monroe Street. The 3 men stopped off at the Jefferson, a hotel on Cherry Street, when they saw Cagle heading in the same direction with 2 of his men. Cagle was hard to miss, since he was wearing Jack Skelcher's sweater that he had taken from him the night of the raid on Earl's place. Earl drew his revolver and charged into the street. Skelcher fired the first shot, hitting Cagle in the back, causing him to fall to his knees. Earl came up behind him, stuck his .45 into the back of Cagle's head, and pulled the trigger. So much for getting even. When Glenn Young was informed of the killing, he stormed into action. Told that the assailants had retreated to the Herrin Hospital, Glenn rounded up a couple hundred armed men and headed for the southwest corner of Harrison and 14th Street. Convinced Deputy Sheriff Ora Thomas and the Sheltons were the culprits, and they were holed up there, Young authorized an attack, For 20 minutes, bullets flew in both directions. The hospital was thoroughly shot up. When everyone ran out of bullets, the attack stopped. Miraculously, no one was killed. By the time the militia arrived the next morning, everyone was gone. "I will kill that son of a bitch," said Ora Thomas. "It's that Thomas bastard and the Sheltons," fumed Glenn Young. "I will kill them all." That night he locked up the mayor and the sheriff and proclaimed himself king.